Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon. Thanks very much for your time. I'm Chatterjee, and I wasn't really, well, I want to first of all thank Metaphorum organisers, John, Angela, Jan, everyone for giving me this time to speak. I wasn't really expecting to speak, so I basically hacked together a couple of presentations that have been done before, one which isn't even mine, to kind of talk about why I'm here and why I'm interested in this forum. You'll notice that I, like our friends with the documentary crew, I'm kind of recording this as part of a podcast series that I'm producing with my account called Adaptive State. And I kind of want to tell you my story and the story that I've seen being a technologist in government in the UK over the last 10 years. And the reason that I want to do that is because I believe that it kind of, when we think about all the changes that we're talking about, these systemic changes, government is undoubtedly a key actor in that. But when we look from outside government and we try to make change happen, we then say, well what can we have to kind of work around it until we can make change happen, let's convince government to do the things it needs to do. I have a different view, having worked within government, and I kind of want to give you an insider's out picture. And I kind of want to talk about how one website has led to a cultural shift, maybe one of the biggest cultural shifts inside government that nobody outside of it really knows about, or maybe they are talking about, but the full implications haven't been realised. So I'm going to spend some time talking to you about that. First, a little bit about me. So these are all the places I've worked. I currently work at NHS Digital. I started off in government working for a department called the Office of the Public Guardian, which deals with mental capacity law, powers of attorney, that kind of thing. I had done a degree in physics, I'm an undergraduate in technological design, but it was just after the economic crash and I was just looking for work, so I ended up government. Then some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about happened, and this new kind of wave of change involving kind of technology and electricity came in. And I joined the civil service fast stream, and I got placed in HMRC, where I spent 4 or 5 years. I did a major project with DWP on a service called Checklist State Pension, which I'll talk more about. And I've been working at NHS Digital for the last 3 years. In terms of what I do, so I work on digital services. I work, particularly I work on the NHS website, the national website, which does kind of advice for people about conditions, also leads to services, helps you find NHS services. We've redeveloped it over the last 3 years, so it's much more accessible to people with all kinds of different conditions, and particularly people who use screen readers, that kind of thing, having a technological baseline. We develop our content in a user-centered, human-centered way, informing it with design research, which I'll talk about a bit more. But I think the thing that's interesting from the perspective of cybernetics is this. So I am a product manager, and I also am practicing product management, which means I help people who do my job learn and develop. And when we work, you may be familiar, I'm sure you've had Agile people here before, but we work in a methodology where we work in multidisciplinary teams. That's all the skills that we need to make something, working collaboratively, continuously. But at the heart of that are kind of 2 roles, and this is where the BSM kind of analogy comes in. So you have product managers and delivery managers, and in a very, very hand-wavy way, you have the team, which is maybe your systems 1, perhaps 2, of people who have knowledge and skills to be able to deliver things. They have a good situational awareness of the system. This could also incorporate people like clinicians, anybody who work with stakeholders, anybody who has operational delivery knowledge. And then you have product management, which is responsible for corralling, not necessarily making, but decisions about direction. What is it that we want to achieve? And managing that on behalf of the team, whilst the delivery manager plays more of a system 3-ish role of thinking about processes, planning, thinking about the health of the team as individuals and as a collective unit. So how did I kind of come to cybernetics? Well, I gave my first conference talk in March this year at a conference called Service Design and Government, where people who design services for government go. It's been running for the last 6 years or so, and I did this talk called How to Create an Adaptive State. It's online, it's on YouTube, go to that link there, bit.ly adaptive state. I won't be talking about that today, because you can go and see that whenever you like. But the point that I was making in that, and this was prior to discovering anything about cybernetics, I was not cybernetically informed at that point, is that adaptive government is the price of progress. And I think in 2019, this is the year when this realization has gone mainstream in the biggest possible way. I don't think there's really any denying it. And so as part of my talk, I was like, well, what does that mean? What does adaptivity mean in the context of government work? And I came to this definition, which is as succinct as I could make it, which is, it remains responsive to change and relevant to human need. Sometimes the way in which organisations work, and I think this is very much part of this philosophy, is that for some reason or another, it loses sight of people's needs. A system evolves which does not key into those. And being responsive to change is the part of adaptivity that we understand. The world is changing, we need to remain effective, we must change in response to it. But it's the combination of those two things that make say, adaptive. And in terms of what that means for decision making, the formulation I had before coming to cybernetics was something about timely, relevant, and informed decision making. So if your decisions aren't timely, you're not prioritising them enough. If they're not relevant, you're not prioritising the right things. If you're not informed, you're not bringing in the right feedback or the right information. So that's where I was in about March this year. One of my kind of heroes in our world is a woman called Erica Hall. She's a design research consultant. If you're doing anything to do with researching the design of something, I would very much recommend Just Enough Research, which has just been released for the second edition. It's a very accessible read, and I think it kind of brings design research to the people in a way. In a way, it's a really good way that if you're working with people who are maybe not familiar with the idea of needing to research, it's a really good primer on that breaks it down really simply. So I was following this lady on Twitter. Oh no, wait a second, this is the point where I have to go off into browser land. And she posted this tweet, and it said, you know, maybe I should recast my thinking about research as a branch of cybernetics. I'm not actually interested in uncovering any new knowledge as much as I am in how organisations learn or refuse to learn, creating feedback loops that disincentivize learning. And then further down, you have a picture of the cyber control room. Some of you will see that familiar. And then you have a picture of this, which is where my rabbit hole begins. And the thing that got me was this bit at the bottom, forward by Brian Eno. I'm like, he's a good egg, I should check this out. So the rest is kind of history. So now I want to tell you the story of what has happened in government, like a cultural change, and it's still quite fringy in its essence, in its substance. But the fact that it's even there and has this foothold and has this place that is increasingly considered essential, I think can be leveraged to involve government more deeply in systemic change of itself to support these aims. But the work is required to communicate that need, and this is where I'm going to require your help, because I've come here to learn more about your story so that I can communicate it to people outside this room, to my colleagues in government who need a case for change. So story time. Way back in 2010, the lady up there is a woman called Martha Lane Fox. She is now Baroness Martha Lane Fox of Soho. She was elected, so she was given a peerage on the basis of the work she did. In 2010, the cabinet minister was a gentleman called Francis Maude. He also now is a lord, so he's been given a peerage for supporting this work. Martha Lane Fox was an advisor carried over from the previous Labour administration. She was the founder of a startup called lastminute.com. If anybody's familiar with that, it was a holiday and travel website. It was very big. Yeah, some people have heard about it. She ran that startup, and she was kept on as an advisor on digital matters and matters of digital government's online presence. She was asked by Francis Maude to kind of analyse the current, in 2010, the government's current online provision. It was a website called DirectGov. And she came up with a set of recommendations that went much broader in scope than that, and she called it revolution, not evolution. And she proposed not only that kind of government websites and provision, which as you will see is really, really scattered and fragmented, be kind of brought under one banner, but that a new base of skill gets created at the centre, and it gets given teeth, it gets given powers to determine how departments spend their money on technology and online services, and it also got rid of the power to set the standards for practice. And it introduced a whole new set of disciplines, designers, programmers who had already existed, but people working much more in line with the ways that the internet had developed over the past 10, 15 years. So the problem was this, hopefully that the volume will be loud enough. So, oh, sorry.
It was hard to work with government.
Oh, sorry, I'll start that again.
In the past, it was hard to work with government. IT contracts went to large providers. Departments worked in silos. There were nearly 2,000 separate government websites. Users deserved better.
The Government Digital Service was created to meet user needs, for citizens and for civil servants. One of the first things we launched was gov.uk, a single domain for government. Every day, 4 million visits are made to gov.uk by people who need to register to vote, apply for a driving licence, or check their state pension. GDS has helped departments to transform by putting users first, growing digital skills through the GDS Academy, developing common components, helping government spend smarter, and opening up procurement.
So that's just kind of the flavour of all the activities that kind of GDS was involved with and given responsibility for. There was mention of about those services you can notify, pay. Those were platform services which government never had before. So if you were working in a department, each department was buying its own pay system, it was buying its own stuff for email. Government as a platform was a strategy that GDS came up, which was basically common technology services, but they were developed in such a way that they were rolled out gradually and developed based on user research, developed based on interacting with people who would actually be effective, which is a core tenet of human-centered or user-centered design research. So that was the problem. So this is how things were done before. This may be familiar to you if you work in any kind of software project context. This is what the thing that kind of Agile is meant to kind of deal with, but it's more than just Agile. It's something about being user-centered. So when you have a need to develop a system, you gather some requirements, you agree a plan based on those requirements, you pick a supplier, you try and figure out whether they can meet those requirements, you plan the project, you start implementation, you finish implementation, and then it gets handed over to some kind of live service team. But the questions that it doesn't really answer is, what if the thing that you decided to make doesn't meet the needs of the users? What if you miss some requirements in that process? Or what if things change? And this is the really important thing, because on the timescales that government was developing services, maybe 2-3 years from inception to release, things could change that would mean that those services were ultimately ineffective at launch. So this was the change that happened, which was driving things from user needs. It became a mantra. There was, in early GDS days, one of the lead designers got frustrated with people using kind of paper personas as a way of representing users. So he ran up to a window, wrote users, ripped a hole in it, pointed an arrow to it so that people would look out of the window down onto the street and actually understand who their users were. And that's quite a famous picture. I didn't put it in my presentation, but it's quite a famous picture for our government, at least digital government now. Once gov.uk had been established, there was a need to bring the departments on board. That was the central publishing house, the central website. But departments were still developing services in a very kind of more archaic way, in a way that wasn't centered around users' needs. So they launched what was called the Exemplar projects. They picked 25 services from across all the major departments, the 25 most important high-volume transactions or interactions that citizens would have with government. And then they launched projects to, with all of those departments to develop those services. This was part of the departments learning how to operate in this way. So there was lots of challenges in them, and they became part of a real. And 25 were picked because they knew some of them weren't going to go that well. They wanted to build up a base of practice. They wanted to get the departments on board, and they knew that there would be some time taken to learn.
Till 2 minutes?
Sorry?
2 minutes? 5 minutes?
5 minutes, okay. So out of that came the service manual, which was the service manual is basically, you can go online, it's published online, everything that was kind of learned through that process. Now that if you're starting to develop a service in government, there is all kinds of support and services there for you, so there's just advice and guidance that's continuously updated and free and available to all. And because that was done in central government, and we started doing the same work in the NHS 3 or 4 years ago, we could lean on that and develop very quickly our own NHS service manuals to help people develop online and digital services in the NHS. However, 10 years on from this happening, adaptive ways of working that we are used to still really aren't the norm in government. And I have some theories about why this is, but this is part of the reason that I'm here. So what's up with that? And I think it comes back to, we've kind of been, the thing that we came here to do has kind of ended up being an albatross around our neck. We are ghettoized as technologists, even though the principles that we can apply, the adaptive practices that have come broadly from the software development world, but have underlying principles that have things in common with the VSM and other cybernetic things, they revolved around the concept of digital services. And so the underlying principles have broader application, but we're still treated like technologists. But there are still things that are very much kind of old school hierarchical organisation about the way in which government works, and we haven't yet broached the conversation where we talk about how we change how governance works, how we change how finance and assurance works, and why do we silo government in the way that we do, when so much of what we do requires skills and expertise that go across our traditional boundaries. That in itself is a huge, huge barrier to thinking more broadly and systemically about our problems. We know that the age we live in demands adaptive government. We know that to be true. We live in this era. I'm just going to point at that for a few seconds so you can kind of understand. How do you regulate that? We've got this going on. all this in the last 5 years particularly, all seems to be moving incredibly fast now. Moore's law and the upward ascent of the exponential. And obviously, most importantly, this. And I won't speak on this because I'm sure there are people here who can speak much more authoritatively than me. But this is really what's lighting a fire under me right now. And I think anybody with half an ounce of sense will be have a fire lit under them by that. Doing this means overcoming government's systemic inertia. And so part of what I'm trying to do with my podcast is tell the hidden story that people don't consider or is perhaps invisible to people working in government and outside it, about how things need to change and change radically. So my appeal to all of you is to help me make the case for change. If you see me waving my microphone around in conversation, don't be afraid, please come and talk to me. I want to capture some of the spirit of the event and the ideas that are here in order to be able to communicate them outward to the people who can't be in this room. And I would be really, really appreciative of your help in that. Tell me the story of your cybernetics. I know that it's not one thing and that it has many applications, as I'm seeing here today. I would love to have conversations with you about it and weave them into this story. And help me make adaptive state a thing. That's ultimately why I'm here. I believe it can happen. I believe we actually have the way more than the will, which might not have been even the case 5 or 6 or 10 years ago. The tools exist, and you are all here because I think you believe that and have seen that too. So help me with that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, one question very fast.
One question.
Or a comment if you want. When you say the adaptive state, you have been talking about the adaptive government. The state is something else.
Fair point. It's a label, it's a handle that I've used because it's catchy, but I can appreciate that we can maybe get into a more in-depth conversation about this thing. That's fair.
Okay.
But we can talk more about that difference if it's useful.
Trinity,
Yes.
have you ever